Can everyone see, can everyone see my screen okay? Give me a thumbs up, a digital or a real one. Okay. And here we go. So this is Planet Microbes, and today we are talking about permafrost, which is very fitting as I'm wearing two pairs of socks right now, and it feels like it's already winter and we haven't even done the time change yet here on the East Coast, but seems like a fitting discussion for the change of the seasons. So first, we have to go over a little bit of background and talk about what is permafrost. Hear a lot about this in the news, with a lot of sort of dire discussion about the state of permafrost, but I think you don't often think about what it actually is and what makes up permafrost. So permafrost is ground that has been completely frozen for at least 2 years. So you can see in this diagram here, it's not like the tundra of Antarctica, where it's just like essentially a desert. It's more of an active ecosystem where there's this active layer of soil on the top. And this layer isn't necessarily frozen year round. As you can see, there can be plants that grow here seasonally. It's this layer where things are actively cycling, photosynthesizing, doing chemical transformations. It's not yet frozen. But if you go deeper down beneath the active layer, that's where the permafrost starts. And all of this stuff is a combination of soil and rocks that's all frozen together in ice. There are even these large pure ice wedges that are dotted throughout the permafrost. And this is in large part in all the regions of permafrost. It's been building up for a really, really long time, since the last glacial maximum, which was 10,000 years ago, and even beyond that. And so all of this material is slowly getting compacted down by new snow and ice. And obviously this is in regions that are really cold. So cold enough that the lower layers stay frozen year round. And where is permafrost? Obviously, it's in places that are really cold, in the North and the South Pole, which is above 60 degrees, or the Arctic region and Antarctic regions, which are above and below 60 degrees north and south. So here on this map, Antarctica, you can see on the right, is really cold all the time, lots of permanently frozen ground. But here in the North Pole, the Arctic, is where a lot of the action and more dynamic regions are happening, are located. So you can see in this image, obviously the very high north is permanently frozen, as is Greenland right here. But then in these gradations of blue, you can see where continuous permafrost shifts to regions that have sporadic or patchy permafrost, to regions that don't have permafrost anymore when it gets warmer further south. So why this is where all of the action is happening is because the Arctic is warming at 2 to 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. So climate change is affecting the Arctic, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, much faster than all of the rest of Earth. So some predictions are saying that up to 65% of the permafrost in this Arctic region here on the left is going to be gone by 2100, at the rates of warming that we're going now. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of the interplay of biological and chemical and physical dynamics that might be driving this permafrost loss, and why that is a big deal and why we should try and limit those changes as much as we can. So like I mentioned before, permafrost is sort of like a time capsule of everything that's been going on since that material was initially frozen. So in the Arctic, in the Northern Hemisphere, the majority of that permafrost has been frozen for as long back as 1,000,000 years, and at least since the last ice age 10,000 years ago. So if the criteria for being permafrost is just that the soil has to have been permanently frozen for the past 2 years, a lot of this permafrost has been frozen for way longer than that. And as you can see in this cross section of permafrost, you can kind of see these different layers as you go deeper. This is basically like you're going back in time. So the stuff that is deeper has been around for a long time, and it keeps getting pushed down deeper and deeper by additional stuff, sediment, snow and ice that gets put on the top. So what has happened in the ensuing, let's just say 10,000 years since all of this permafrost was deposited, and what types of things might be stored in this time capsule of permafrost? What do you all think? Any ideas about what might be trapped in these permanently frozen, but potentially not frozen for much longer layers? Tina says microbes. A good and very fitting guess, considering where we are right now. Beth says gas. That is a good option. What kind of gas? All kinds of gas. Does anyone else want to jump in with what types of gas might be stored in there? It's one that we hear about a lot on the news.
I go with methane.
Oh yeah, for sure. Methane is trapped in there. Kamal says CO2, heavy metals, nitrogen. Yeah, all of these are trapped in there. In particular, methane and CO2 are the big ones because they're greenhouse gases. So methane is much less abundant than CO2, but it is a much more powerful greenhouse gas agent. So mole to mole, it warms up the planet much more. But CO2 is a big one that's in there too. These systems hold just a ton of organic carbon. And as you start to thaw it, all of these things get liberated. So the nitrogen that Tina said, when that gets liberated, nitrogen is a fertilizer for these systems. So it enables the microbial gears of permafrost to start churning again, and things can start becoming more active. And as these microbes are breaking down all of that organic carbon, what are they producing? What's the byproduct of these microbial activities and respiration? Just like us, it's CO2, sometimes methane, sometimes sulfur, like Tina just mentioned. And yeah, Skylar, mammoths are down there. Mammoths are down there too. I really wanted to show a bog body in this one, but peat bogs are a little bit different than permafrost. But yeah, there is all kinds of stuff down there, and heavy metals as well. And that brings up the heavy metals that Deborah wrote in the chat, sort of brings up another thing. What has happened in the ensuing 10,000 years? Well, the blossoming of human society, the Industrial Revolution, and us having way more cars, the invention of cars, all of that stuff is trapped in the permafrost, in addition to all of these microbes and these nutrients and carbon, and all of that has the potential to be liberated as it starts to thaw. So we've already, sort of touched on why we care about keeping this permafrost frozen, but maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about that. Like, why do we actually care about keeping this permafrost frozen? Why do we want to keep all of this stuff locked away and cryogenically preserved? Any ideas? I mean, a big one is that all that CO2, we are already pumping out a ton of CO2 every time we fly or drive or turn on our air conditioning or heat our houses. To add additional CO2 into the atmosphere from thawing permafrost, that is just additional stuff that we haven't even accounted for, that might go on to warm the planet. Yeah, Skylar says, so bacteria and viruses don't come out for sure. We don't know what pathogens potentially could have been locked away for the past 10,000 years. And Deborah raises a really good point. It's sort of like that Greek myth where you open up the box and then all of the evils come out. So we have no way of knowing what chain reaction we might cause by letting out additional viruses or bacteria or heavy metals. And we'll touch on some of those, what we call feedback loops, later on in our discussion, that might, these feedback loops that might accelerate climate change even more. So yeah, we have overall a vested interest in keeping this Pandora's box or time capsule closed. The ones that they talked about, I think we hit on all of these actually, that they talk about in this paper. So carbon in all of its many forms, like CO2 and methane, and organic carbon that microbes can eat, the microbes themselves, like bacteria, viruses, potentially viruses that are pathogenic to humans, anthropogenic chemicals like heavy metals like mercury, or things like chlorinated fluorocarbons that are the product of industrial activities, pesticides, antibiotics, all different kinds of human chemicals. And one thing we didn't mention is nuclear waste. So nuclear testing, wherever it is on Earth, releases radioactive elements that travel around in the atmosphere and ultimately get deposited into terrestrial systems. I read in the review article that we're reading tonight that the Soviet Union from 1955 to the 90s tested like hundreds and hundreds of nuclear detonations up in the Arctic. And all of that fallout has also been preserved in these time capsules of permafrost. So, you know, what happens once we open that up, and all of that nuclear waste comes out again. And that brings us to the paper that we will be discussing today. So emergent biogeochemical risks from Arctic permafrost degradation, which was published just last month in the journal Nature Climate Change. And this is a little bit different than the papers that we usually discuss, because as a review article, this is more of a synthesis of all of the recent research on this topic that these authors hope will shine a light on this important issue and serve as a template for discussion and a springboard for future research. So they are kind of summarizing all of the research that's been done on what might happen when permafrost thaws, and then offering their ideas about where the field should go and what the most important things we need to research in this topic are. So I also thought it was just really nifty to think about what might happen from a microbial perspective, both the positives and the negatives, as permafrost thaws. So let's jump right in and look at a survey of the permafrost time capsule in more detail. These are the main things that the authors pointed out that might be frozen in permafrost that we should be most worried about. So, and we mentioned all of these. So viruses, here they're showing the smallpox virus. Why is this a pertinent virus to point out for as a threat for thawing permafrost? Anyone have any ideas about why smallpox might have been highlighted? Did I see a hand from Beth?
Yeah, this is a guess, but I'm gonna go for it anyway. Is it because we like don't vaccinate against it anymore and like people are worried about it re-emerging? Is that?
Yeah, because it's been eradicated, right? As a result of the vaccination efforts. So, you know, maybe it exists in a freezer somewhere in the Pentagon, or somewhere in Russia. But yeah, like Beth said, smallpox is effectively eradicated, and so we don't immunize people to smallpox anymore. So if this were to be released, that might be lights out for very scary. Oh, Deborah says there was an outbreak of smallpox in a lab in Great Britain about 30 years ago. Do you know how that happened and how they contained it?
I don't actually know how they contained it. I don't remember. I do remember that people who had been vaccinated got sick from it, though.
Mm.
It was in a lab and somehow got into the what do you call it? The air filtration system.
Well, hopefully that prompted them to update their HVAC systems. And maybe they fared a little bit better, that lab, during COVID as a result of that scare. But yeah, I haven't heard of that. I should look into that and see, because I don't even know if they have like a store of vaccines floating around for like ready to use in the event that bioterrorism or thawing permafrost causes another outbreak. That's scary to think about. And especially if you can't really control it because it's just coming from, you know, as a result of climate change. Spooky. Then here's a CFC, I believe is what this is. So anthropogenic chemicals. A lot of these chemicals were used as refrigerants or pesticides, and a couple decades ago, you know, it was shown that these are greenhouse gases or are eating holes in the ozone layer. And so many of them have really strict regulations or have been outlawed from being used. But so their amounts in the atmosphere, present day atmosphere, have declined, but atmospheric deposition could have put them into permafrost, and those could be liberated again, and then we're sort of, you know, back at square one. Heavy metals like mercury, again, this is a byproduct of mining and industrial activities that can get aerosolized and then put into the atmosphere. It's of course a human toxin, so we don't want that to be liberated and back into waterways and animals that we eat. Again, like some of these atmospheric chemicals, mercury, just in the past couple of years, has had much stricter regulations that limit its use in mining and industrial activities. But you know, having all of this past mercury liberated would put us again back at square one. Nuclear waste, which we talked about, and ancient DNA. Here's a depiction of a mammoth for Skylar. You know, there could be positive and negative things. Like it could enable us to study the critters that were around 10,000 years ago, but you know, it could also lead to antibiotic resistance or sharing of genes between different organisms. So microbes are promiscuous. So if there's any naked DNA in the environment, they can snatch that up and incorporate it into their own genomes. And then finally, of course, what we care the most about are bacteria and other microbes. So there are the potentially more benign bacteria, like alpha proteobacteria. If those are released, you know, it might just change the microbial ecology of the environment. But then there are also potential pathogenic bacteria that could be released, like Clostridium. And one of the interesting things that they talked about in this paper that I had actually never heard of are Methuselah microbes. Did anyone catch or know why they might call these microbes that have been frozen for up to 1 million years Methuselah? I will admit that I had to Wikipedia Methuselah. I'm not up on my biblical characters, I must admit.
Methuselah was the oldest of the antediluvian patriarchs. So before the flood, he was the one who lived, like, he was 976, I think, in the Old Testament.
Yeah, so he was old, or reputedly old at the time of his death. So the idea here is that you know, permafrost soil, even when it's been frozen for 1 million years, a single gram of that soil can contain hundreds to thousands of different microbial taxa and even more different flavors of virus. And many of these organisms are capable of remaining viable for that entire time period. So, you know, that's why they call them Methuselah, because they are really old, but they are still kicking. And all it takes is thawing that soil to not even bring them back to life, because they haven't actually been dead, but just to enable them to live more freely, if you will, out of the shackles of the frozen soil. So I'm just curious, of all of these things, which is the scariest thing to be liberated for all of you? I will admit that I am less scared of the bacteria and viruses than some of the other stuff. Tina's afraid of the nukes. Yeah, I have to, yeah, well, it's a grab bag. Everyone is afraid of something different, which is a good thing, maybe? Yeah, Jonathan says the carbon dioxide. That's what I'm most worried about, I have to say, because I don't know if anyone has been following the news from the COP conference that's going on in Scotland right now, where all of the many world leaders are meeting to discuss sort of the fate of our planet in light of climate change, and a lot of them are making pledges to reduce carbon emissions, but you know, a pledge is just a pledge, and no one is really held to actually reaching those things. But it seems unlikely that we will get to the targets that we need to avoid catastrophic damage. Yeah, climate crises, pretty dire and alarming, I agree. But I'm also afraid of the mercury and things like those heavy metals, because those can get transported into waterways and bioaccumulate, which is sort of like when like a microbe will take up mercury, and then a larger critter will eat that microbe, and then that larger critter will get eaten by a fish, and it will cause that mercury to accumulate up the food chain until salmon or seals or something like that that are important food sources around the world, but also to indigenous Arctic populations, and it can have serious health concerns as a result of consumption of that. So it's all a little bit scary, I will admit. But then here is just a list of all of the grab bag of fun stuff that has been sampled in years and years of research on permafrost. So pesticides like DDT, uranium and plutonium, these toxic chemicals as a result of being used as preservatives or in industrial applications that cause cancer and birth defects, heavy metals, lead, mercury, and chromium, all of these different bacteria that they have found. So yeah, it is a grab bag of different scary stuff. But, you know, it's scary, but there are lots of interesting microbial adaptations and applications and nifty microbial traits that that exist in this permafrost that are, you know, ripe for discovery because they've never been seen before. They've been trapped down there for a million years. So if you were a microbe, what strategies would you use to survive in permafrost? If you are a Methuselah microbe, what important things would you need to do to be able to weather a million years of really, really crappy weather? Yeah, so Naomi says, really good at hibernation. Yeah, you might decide, you know what, trying to eke out a living in these really cold conditions, it's not for me. I'm gonna shut everything down, and you can wake me up when humans come around and start destroying the climate and things thaw, and I will wake up. So, and that's similar to Deborah's idea. So they can form cysts, which are these resting stages where they're really, really sturdy, really hardy, but they're not doing anything. They are essentially in a cryogenic slumber, waiting for conditions to get better. Beth says a sturdy cell wall. That's a great idea. The other thing that they might do is maybe they want to have a more flexible cell wall because, you know, like what I always think of is you can tell the changing of the seasons by the jar of coconut oil in your pantry. So as it gets warmer and colder, it goes from liquid back to a solid. So if you are a microbe and that's your cell wall, if your cell wall becomes really, really rigid, then you know, it's likely to break and rupture, and that's your house. And so you don't want all of your innards to be spewed out into the environment. And similar to that, Kamal says there are antifreeze proteins. That's exactly right. Actually, the enzymes that have antifreeze properties have actually been co-opted and used in ice cream and other frozen foods because if anyone has ever made ice cream at home, you know, you kind of have to eat it on the same day. I don't know if anyone else has an ice cream machine, but it's good on like the first day. And then after that, it's like a solid brick. And that's because for the average home cook, you don't have access to these antifreeze enzymes that food scientists have co-opted from bacteria to lower the freezing temperature of food and keep it at a nice picture perfect scoopable consistency. So, but I will say the other thing is that they do want to make their cell walls sturdier by way of kind of repairing any damage that they might have. So additional enzymes for cell wall repair, bulking that up, making sure that it's not breaking open, for DNA damage and oxidative damage, all of that stuff to make the cell more hardy. What other ideas are in here? Well, yeah, or Jonathan says, maybe just slow down their metabolism so that they are still alive. They're not hibernating per se, but they are eating and breathing really, really slowly. And it's, you know, it's a tough environment. Everything is frozen. It's hard to get the nutrients, the sugars, et cetera, that you need to grow. So here are some of the things that they talked about in the paper. I think we actually hit on almost all of these. So pigments, that's why you might be wondering why I have this picture of orange vegetables, but carotenoids are pigments that you might find in carrots or butternut squash, but those are pictured here in these chemical diagrams, and those are pigments that protect from UV damage and oxidative damage, so making the cell more hardy. Membrane fluidity, so you don't get frozen and then shatter. Repairing DNA damage and membranes. Scavenging detrital biomass is one thing that we didn't talk about. So, you know, a microbe has to eat, and if you are frozen in place for the past 1,000,000 years, the first thing that is going to get eaten is all the good stuff, all of the really labile, delicious carbon compounds. That's all going to get eaten, you know, in the first month or however long. What are you going to survive on for the next 1,000,000 years if all the good stuff off the shelves has already been eaten? So one adaptation might be developing ways to break down the carbon compounds or the chemicals that are really hardy, the stuff that no one else wants. So that's what detrital biomass is. It's sort of the waste products that are left over. These microbes have developed a way to eke out a living by eating the stuff that no one else wants. Josh raises a good point in the, would UV damage be an issue in permafrost? No, and this is my fault for Googling what do carotenoids actually protect against, and it is not, well, they do protect against UV damage. That's one thing that they do, but probably not in permafrost. I was disappointed and had to go disappointed in the review because they didn't actually say what carotenoids do in the review, and I had to look it up. But maybe a carrot needs to protect against oxidative damage, but not a permafrost microbe. But oxidative damage, I mean, that can happen all the time as a byproduct of metabolism. So oxidative damage is so like peroxide is a hydrogen peroxide. The way that it works and why you put it on a cut or a scrape or stitches is because that oxidatively damages cells. It breaks their DNA, bursts open their membranes, and that is because of reactions with oxygen, with extra electrons that cells and biological material just really doesn't like. But these pigments can sort of take the blow of that oxidative damage instead of DNA or enzymes or cell membranes. So that is what those pigments are doing. Oxygen is a really toxic chemical that microbes really had to evolve a way to survive in the presence of. For a long time of Earth's history, there was not abundant oxygen, and then thanks to oxygenic photosynthesizers, they produced a lot of oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, and that caused a mass extinction. And since then, all critters from microbes to mammoths have had to adapt to survive in some pretty harsh conditions. And then, so these are all the things that microbes might do to survive in permafrost, but what about viruses? If you were a virus, what would you want to do to survive for a long time in permafrost? Any ideas? Yeah, Tina says, look for bacteria buddies. And that is a perfect place to start when we talk about viruses. So are viruses alive? Is my next question. Maybe. You know, this is really a philosophical question. You could argue that they are alive or not alive. I usually say when I talk about viruses that they are biological entities. So there's a lot about them that is similar to a living organism. They have a genome. They are made out of organic stuff. They can replicate. They can shut down human society for, what is it now? Almost 2 years. However, they are obligate intracellular parasites. Without a host, a virus is nothing but a little package of proteins with some DNA or RNA inside. That's not very scary, right? But in the presence of their host, they can wreak havoc, but they cannot divide on their own. They cannot do any metabolism without their host. So they're an obligate intracellular parasite that without that host, they're not alive. So as Tina was saying, they need to look for bacteria buddies, but if you have been frozen for 1 million years, like the chance, if you're a virus that's trapped here and the host is trapped here, like how will you ever meet in the middle so that this virus can infect this microbe? And then, does it really make evolutionary sense for this virus to spend the last little bit of energy that it has to make new virus babies and then spit those out, killing the cell? So now what do you have? You've got another frozen pocket of all of your progeny, all of your virus babies with nowhere to go and no one to infect. And then you are, that's lights out for you as a virus. Good luck finding another cell to infect. So has anyone heard of the difference between the lytic and lysogenic cycle of viruses? Jonathan has. So
yeah, I don't remember which one is which, but I know one of them like stays inside of the host and makes more and just kind of chills, and then and maybe buds, I don't remember, but one of them like busts open the cells.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, Jonathan and Skylar and Beth are exactly right. So a virus has, well, there are two different paths that a virus, the hypothetical virus could go down. So, and that is, both of these paths are depicted in this little schematic image here. So this little lunar lander looking thing is our toy virus. This gray circle is a cell. And then this little tiny oval is the genome. So the virus lands, it injects its DNA or RNA, its genome into the cell. If it is the lytic cycle, that's the one that basically self-destructs and as a way to release more virus into the environment. So after infecting the cell, it co-opts the cellular machinery and reroutes all of that host cell's metabolism to make new baby viruses. And then ultimately, it gets to a point where that cell can no longer hold all of those viruses, and then it explodes, releasing those viruses into the environment where they will go on to infect anyone else who they run into. In the lysogenic cycle, things are a little bit different. So here you can see the lunar lander virus deposits its genome into the cell, and then rather than making new virus particles, that virus's genome will integrate itself into the host's genome. And then it'll just hang out there, biding its time until conditions are better. So Kamal asks a great question. Can all viruses elect to be lytic or lysogenic, or is it specific to the type of virus? So no, many viruses are either one or the other. So I was going to say, I don't know actually if COVID ever integrates into, I don't think COVID ever integrates into human cells, into human genomes. So COVID is an example of a virus that is only lytic. So it's only ever going to make new cells and kill the host cell and move on. And Jonathan brought up herpes, and that's a great example of a virus, a human pathogen that is lysogenic. So if you get infected with herpes, that is going into your cells, and then it actually travels into nerve cells that are far away from, say, your face, where you might have gotten infected with herpes. That virus will hang out intercalated in your genome for a long time until it comes back and pops out in the form of a cold sore. And that requires the virus to travel down the nerve and then pop out on your face. And that's the only time where that person can spread herpes to someone else. So it's the only time that the virus is self-destructing those cells. And that is literally an effort to spread that virus to someone else. So what types of conditions might cause a lysogenic virus that is intercalated in its host genome to switch over to lytic? Because you wouldn't want to stay lysogenic forever, because then you would never spread your genome and move to a new host. But so what might these lysogenic viruses be waiting for? Yeah, Naomi and Josh and Scott, I guess too. But oh yeah, everyone has great ideas. So environmental change, heat and light, nutrients, those are big ones. So if you are, and in the case of permafrost, sure, hang out integrated, biding your time while things are frozen, the moment that it starts to thaw, maybe nutrients are liberated, the nitrogen and carbon compounds that we talked about earlier, all of a sudden, it's like a field day. The microbe can start growing again. This virus is maybe thinking, well, if my host is now all of a sudden in a windfall for nutrients and it's growing, maybe that means that it's going to have some friends who are around it. And now's a good time to kill this host and jump to thousands more. So yeah, when conditions get better, deactivation of the cell cycle that Kamal said, so, and cellular activity. So that is sort of like the opposite situation of what we just talked about. So if it looks like your ship is sinking, you want to get in that escape pod and launch yourself out and try and find a new host before the host that you're in takes you down with the ship. So if this lysogenic cell, if that cell dies with the virus still integrated in the genome, then that virus is effectively dead as well. There's no chance that it will ever be able to hop into a new host or make new viruses if the host cell is dead. It's an obligate intracellular parasite. It's not alive. It needs its host cell machinery. And if that host is dead, this is just a piece of DNA that can't do any damage. So that's why one of the reasons you can, to go back to herpes, people who get cold sores often find that when they're under a lot of stress, that might lead to a cold sore outbreak on them. And that's because, or it's thought that the virus is thinking, ooh, my host is feeling pretty stressed. Maybe they're gonna bite the dust. I better try and jump to a new host as quickly as I can. So yeah, all great ideas. So that might be one way that viruses are surviving in permafrost. So this switch from lytic to lysogenic. And all of this stuff is waiting in permafrost, waiting to thaw. So I really liked one of the quotes from the paper that says, it is clear that the chemical footprint of global anthropogenic activities over the last century is unequivocally reemerging in the Arctic. So all this stuff, from viruses to cells, to bacteria cells, to chemicals, heavy metals, carbon, it is all, even though the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in the Arctic and cars aren't driving around in the Arctic is storing all of this stuff, and it's all reemerging now as a result of human-induced climate change. And I mentioned some feedback loops that might be happening, that have a cascade of effects that influence future climate change and us as well. So even though the Arctic is thawing, the effects of that don't just happen in the Arctic, but they have impacts on all of us. So this is a schematic diagram that sort of illustrates some of these feedback loops. So we have permafrost thawing, and that's exposing atmospheric chemicals, nutrients, microbes, particulates, all of the stuff we talked about. And that is inducing ecosystem changes. So all of a sudden, these systems are churning away again, doing biogeochemical transformations, spitting out more carbon, and literally thawing. And that is redistributing all of the stuff that was previously frozen. And once it's frozen, it's no longer locked in place. And so it can move to a different system, maybe further south, downstream, be that other regions that were permanently frozen, or or systems further south that weren't permafrost. But now all of a sudden you have chemicals and microbes that have never been in these systems before. Now they're interacting with the endemic microbes as a result of permafrost thaw channels carrying these chemicals and organisms to a new spot. And of course, we have all of the carbon and methane, or CO2 and methane that's being released. So thawing permafrost is often said to be a positive feedback on climate change. Does anyone know what that means precisely? Yeah, reinforcing, or, oh, sorry, Tina. So I said, I was asking what it actually means that thawing permafrost is a positive feedback on climate change, or a positive feedback loop. Yeah, exactly. These are all great things in the chat. So everyone has the right idea. So as permafrost thaws and more CO2 is released, that is a greenhouse gas that will further warm the planet and cause subsequently more CO2 to be released and the climate to warm even more. So exactly, it's building up more. It's adding fuel to the fire. And the same thing goes with methane. And the same thing goes with decreasing snow cover, changes the albedo. Has anyone heard of albedo before? Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, light from the moon. It's the reflectivity of a surface for sunlight, essentially. So the snow and snow cover and ice is really reflective. So sunlight comes in. If it hits snow, it's more likely for that light and heat to bounce off of the snow and ice and then shoot back into the atmosphere, and it doesn't get warmed. But what happens to something really dark, like soil or all the permafrost that is no longer frozen? That material is no longer reflective. The albedo has changed, and so that sunlight, instead of getting reflected off, gets absorbed, and so that starts to warm up even more. So that's another feedback on climate change, where the less ice there is, the more these systems can absorb the heat from the sun, and then they accelerate further permafrost thaw and microbial liberation, and like Deborah said, opening up that Pandora's box of stuff. And all of the stuff that's liberated isn't in isolation either. So the microbes and the chemicals might interact. So thawing permafrost could potentially release toxic chemicals. And so one idea is that maybe these toxic chemicals could at least kill all of the microbes and prevent them from killing us. What do you all think of that potential scenario? Unlikely. I think so too. One of the things that the paper talked about was that these Methuselah microbes might be just really good at dealing with pretty gnarly conditions. So if you have been surviving for 1,000,000 years, are you going to let a little mercury wipe you out? Or maybe all of the adaptations that they have for oxidative damage and stress response and growing really slowly or forming cysts, maybe they will use those strategies in their toolbox to survive through these chemical and microbial interactions in the thawed permafrost. And Josh says most of them are already extremophiles already. Exactly, yeah. I mean, this is some of the most extreme conditions on Earth, and these critters have been eking out a living this whole time. So they're probably already pretty good at surviving. So chances are they have already within their genomes mechanisms to detoxify or to ride out these bad conditions until times get better. And then, you know, not to be all doom and gloom all the time for this paper, but they did mention just a handful of potentially silver linings for what discoveries might be lurking. So maybe what came out of Pandora's box after all of the evils came out, was it like a butterfly that symbolized hope? So what are the butterflies that might be lurking in at the bottom of this Pandora's box of permafrost? One of the things the paper mentioned was that they found a new species of a particular type of bacteria called Flavobacterium in oil contaminated Arctic permafrost. And when they started looking into this Flavobacterium, they found that it was able to really, really efficiently take up oil from the contaminated soil around it once it thawed. So what are the potential applications of that? Yeah, oil spill cleanup. Christian asks if bacteria can survive silver. So that's a good point. Silver is really toxic, and like silver nanoparticles in soil can be really toxic to microbes. But they probably have detoxification mechanisms. I haven't read anything about the silver detoxification mechanisms in bacteria, but I know that they have like arsenic detoxification pathways. So I'm sure especially in environments where silver deposition for whatever reason is really high, I'm sure that microbes have developed a way to detoxify from those compounds. Yeah, oil spill cleanup. What other potential silver linings might there be for? I'm struggling to think of any more, honestly, other than this one, because you know, other than antifreeze proteins that might make ice cream last longer. Oh yeah, Naomi and Scott say maybe microbes that can eat methane. So yeah, maybe there are biological capabilities that we haven't even conceived yet that could actually have a positive impact on the climate. Yeah, Kamal raises a really good point about whether previously permanently frozen environments might suddenly become forested again. So that is a topic that is super debated by scientists. So, you know, if there are no trees in permafrost, You can't grow crops there. We need to feed people. So as soon as permafrost and the Arctic starts to thaw, that means that forests and trees and vegetation can move further north. It could be a way to feed Earth's growing population by planting crops there. Forests, trees are the lungs of Earth. So there is a huge potential for them to plant forests in regions that were previously frozen, which could potentially take up CO2. One of the resolutions that came out today at the COP global climate meeting that I mentioned was a commitment to stop deforestation. And I saw that even Brazil has been doing, is in the news a lot for deforestation of the Amazon, even signed on for that. So that's really good news. There's been a lot of research published in the past couple years about how we could reverse the amount of CO2 we have just by planting more forests. So yeah, that's a great point, Kamal. You could definitely, that is one silver lining. Of course, that is a major ecological shift that requires modeling and additional study to figure out what all of the, whether the pros and the cons of that actually line up. And yeah, ice cream is my priority as well. When all you have is bad news, ice cream doesn't sound so bad. And then we kind of touched on all of this stuff, but what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So in this image, you can see how the water that has thawed from permafrost snakes its way ultimately to the ocean, and it's carrying with it all of the microbes and chemicals that have been liberated. And so that enters waterways and global ocean circulation. And then what is easy to dismiss as an Arctic problem quickly becomes a global problem. As the Arctic gets easier to go to, sure, we could plant forests, but then you also open up opportunities for cross North Pole trade, which is probably bad for the climate because of emissions. You also open opportunities for ecotourism, which is for the same reasons, not that great a lot of times. And then did anyone catch the part in the paper about birds? Why do we care about birds? Migrating Arctic seabirds. Any idea why birds might pose a little bit of a problem? So poop, always a good guess for anything in biology. But what about the poop per se would be? Carry microbes. So Jonathan says maybe they're carrying microbes around, seeds, microbes. Yeah, Tina, I think, put it all together. So birds eat somewhere, whether they're eating microbes or seeds or the heavy metals that are liberated. And so a lot of birds go up to the Arctic in the Northern Hemisphere summer to eat or lay their eggs. Then they're doing a lot of eating, cavorting around with each other in the Arctic. And then if all of this gnarly stuff is liberated, then the birds are eating mercury or radioactive material or microbes. And then they fly back to wherever they go in the Northern Hemisphere winter, further south. And then they poop out all of that potentially toxic stuff someplace new. And it is really hard to control all of that. So birds as a vector of moving all of this stuff in the Pandora's box of permafrost someplace else. So that is the summary of the paper. And now I just put down, oh, Josh mentions ice nucleating particles. What about that did you find spooky? Yeah, so ice nucleating particles, those are particles that get stirred up, little specks that get stirred up into the atmosphere, and they can serve as cloud. They're also sometimes called cloud condensation nuclei. So they are basically the seeds of clouds, and clouds have an enormous impact on the climate by insulating things or reflecting light, and by changing weather patterns, like Josh says. And they are, it's funny because you see clouds all the time. Every time you look at the sky, you see clouds. We see them go by, but they are one of the least understood parts of climate science. They are very hard to predict. We have very little understanding of how they impact the climate and where and when. And these ice nucleating particles is just another example of one thing that impacts cloud formation and subsequently the climate. And we have very little understanding of where these things come from, when there are more of them in the atmosphere or less, and how they might go on to make clouds. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's a great point. Kamal asked us if it rained for 2 million years straight in the Triassic. I have no idea. Maybe. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And since we are a tiny group, maybe we can all just come together to have a chat about any questions or what parts of this you found the most scary, what the butterflies of hope were for you at the bottom of this frozen permafrost, and anything microbial that you wanted to talk about.